Welcome to Episode 5 of Angela Watson's Truth for Teachers. I'm your host, Angela Watson, and I'm here to speak life, encouragement, and truth into the minds and hearts of educators and get you energized for the week ahead. Today, I'm going to share some thoughts on how to empower students to take ownership of their learning. Welcome to the show. I want to start by thanking you for listening and encouraging you to leave a review for the show. Podcast reviews are super important. The more reviews we have, the more easily discoverable the show will be, and the more teachers will be able to reach and inspire. You can visit truthforteachers.com to learn more. We talked in the last episode about the importance of creating a reciprocal energy flow, gaining energy from kids instead of letting them drain you. This week's episode is really a continuation of that topic because if you want to get anything back from your kids, they've got to have some ownership of the learning. Tell me if this is a really familiar scene in your classroom. You ask a question, and the same 4 kids raise their hands every time. The kids aren't listening to your directions. They have no idea what to do for a task, and so you just keep repeating yourself. You're constantly trying to convince them that the topic is exciting and that the task is going to be fun. But they're dragging their heels, and they're only completing the work if you're standing over them and you're praising and you're encouraging or threatening, yelling, bribing, whatever trick you decide to pull out of your bag that day. If you can relate to that scenario, there's nothing to be embarrassed about. Every teacher has been there, and most of us feel like that on a regular basis. It's very normal, but it doesn't have to be that way. The more ownership of the learning that you hand over to students, the more engagement you're going to have. So how do you do that? First and foremost, you've got to make the learning matter. If the tasks that you're giving to your students are irrelevant, you're going to have to work twice as hard to get the kids to participate, and you're not going to get any energy back from them. Kids need to have a meaningful purpose for their work, just like we as teachers do. They need to believe that the tasks they do make a difference beyond the 4 walls of the classroom. Student engagement comes naturally when kids identify a need or a problem in the world, and then they create ways to use skills that you've taught them to solve those problems. My friend Jenny teaches 3rd grade, and she blogs about it at Lucky Frog's Lily Pad. And last spring, her class completed this amazing project that I think is the perfect example of how to turn the learning over to your students. They'd already finished their standardized testing for the year, and they had a little bit more flexibility in the curriculum and the scheduling. So Jenny helped them identify a need in their community. They wanted to help people in a nearby town who were affected by tornadoes. One of the kids got the idea to sell lemonade. Listen to all these skills that Jenny had her kids practice. They estimated their costs. They raised capital. They asked the PTA to become an investor. They created a Google form to organize parent volunteers and a Google Doc to create a schedule. They made persuasive advertisements. They did a science experiment to find the perfect lemonade recipe. They counted the money they made. They wrote thank you notes. These students' learning resulted in changing outcomes. Their hard work wasn't just to get an A on a paper. Their work mattered to other people, to those victims of the tornado. Though it probably won't be possible to do something like that for every lesson you teach, I encourage you to use stories like these as inspiration and make your students' learning matter in any way that you can. Here's the thing. If your students are sharing their work with the world, they want it to be good. If they're just sharing it with you, they want it to be good enough. Most kids are not excited about writing a paragraph when the only person who's going to read it is the teacher, and he's just going to mark it up and explain everything that's wrong with it. So try to publish kids' work as much as possible, even if it's just on your school website or your class blog. Look for ways to give kids an authentic audience that they care about and that they'll work hard to impress. The learning matters more when you get kids connected with the outside world. Have your students participate in a project started by my dear friend Pernille Rip. It's called the Global Read Aloud. Students all around the world read the same book, and then they discuss it with other classes via Skype. You can go to globalreadaloud.com to learn more. Or here's another idea. You would be amazed at how many children's book authors are willing to do a Google Hangout with classes. Imagine how motivated some of your students would be to read a book if they knew they would get to ask questions afterwards from the author. You'll notice in all of these examples, not only does the learning matter, but the responsibility for the learning has in large part been placed in the hands of students. And that's a really important strategy for gaining energy from kids. Get kids actively involved in their learning so that they are doing just as much work, even more work, than you are. When students take charge of the learning process, they're able to channel their excess energy into pursuits that matter. And as their teacher, you become re-energized from watching the learning process in action and interacting with kids who are actually enthusiastic about their work. The flow of energy in the classroom becomes reciprocal as you motivate them and they in turn motivate you. So, how can you get started with empowering kids to take more ownership of their learning? The brilliant Alan November once posed a question that I think is a fantastic starting point. He said, "What are you doing in your classroom now that you could turn over to students to do themselves?" What are you doing in your classroom now that you could turn over to your students to do themselves? Maybe you can do more student-directed projects. Maybe you can involve students in the assessment process and give them a chance to create rubrics and the grading criteria and score themselves. Maybe you can use technology to give kids more choice in how they demonstrate knowledge. These kinds of ways of turning the learning over to students is probably the best way I've seen to increase student engagement. You see, engagement is not the same thing as compliance. Some of our best students are simply people pleasers. They sit up straight and they fold their hands on their desk because they're doing what we tell them to do, not because they're truly invested in their own learning. There's a big difference between being busy and being truly engaged. Sometimes kids know how to go through the motions without really learning, or they're hard at work on a task that's not going to produce any real gains. So here's an easy way to get insight as to who has ownership of the learning. When kids are truly taking ownership, they will be asking questions which drive learning. If the teacher's doing all the questioning and the students are just answering, it's possible the kids are being busy or compliant, but they're not truly engaged. The goal is to get kids asking questions like why, how, what happens if, couldn't we try? When they're posing questions like that, and when they're posing questions that matter to them, and then pursuing the answers, you can be sure they're thinking deeply about the topic and they're invested in their own learning. I go into a lot more depth about empowering students to take ownership of their learning in my upcoming book that I plan to release this spring. It's called Unshakable: 20 Ways to Enjoy Teaching Every Day, No Matter What. You can go to thecornerstoneforteachers.com and click on Books at the top of the page to learn more about Unshakable. And there you can sign up to be notified by email when it's available, and you'll receive sample chapters in advance before anyone else. I like to end each podcast episode with the motivational quote for the week ahead that I call the takeaway truth. And here's the takeaway truth that I want you to remember this week. The person doing the most talking is the person doing the most learning. Give kids a chance to talk, to construct their own knowledge, to give input as to what they learn and how they learn it. And you'll find that their engagement levels shoot way up. In return, you're going to experience a new sense of motivation and energy as your students start giving just as much as they're getting. Thanks for listening. Have a fantastic week. You can do this. And remember, it's not going to be easy. It's going to be worth it.